Hi, this is Sadashiva Pai from Science Mission. Today we have Dr. Satchidananda Panda from Salk Institute of Biological Sciences with us. So he's the professor of Regulatory Biology Lab. Dr. Panda is interested in understanding the molecular mechanism of the biological clock in mouse model system. So the biological clock or the circadian oscillator in most organisms coordinates behavior and physiology with the natural light dark cycle. So his laboratory uses genetic, genomic, and biochemical approaches to identify the genes under circadian regulation in different organs and to understand the mechanism of such regulation. Dr. Panda has won several awards to his credit and is in the editorial board of several journals. He has also published more than 90 articles in peer-reviewed journals like Science, Nature, Cell Metabolism, Cell Reports, etc. So please welcome Dr. Panda. So welcome
Hi.
to Science.
Hi, I'm glad to be here, Sadasiv. You're doing something really
Thank
great.
you. Thank you. Let's get going. So can you please talk about yourself, your background, education, etc.?
Excuse me. Yeah, so, um, I have a PhD in molecular biology, and actually during my PhD, I worked on plant circadian clock, how plants measure time, and then how they use this clock to figure out what season it is so that they can flower.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, in the right season. So whether it's summer season or winter season. So then after PhD, I got interested in animal circadian rhythms. So during my postdoc at Novartis, I started working on circadian rhythms in rodents and insects. And then almost 15 years ago, I joined the Salk Institute as a assistant professor working on continue to work on circadian rhythms. And it has been almost 15 years at Salk, and now I'm a full professor at Salk.
Okay. Uh, just talk to us about your lab people.
Yeah, so my lab is at the Salk Institute, which is has a very profound, very interesting architecture. And the lab has nearly 10 people who work on various aspects of rhythms. Some work on the molecular mechanism, some work on the how the clock senses light, and then some are working on how circadian clock interacts with what, when, and how much we eat, and how it
Mhm.
affects our health. So that's briefly about the lab.
Okay. And I know like a PhD takes long time, 5, 6 years. So how do you motivate these people to get going?
Well, humans are the only species who are really curious um, and can innovate something, can imagine something, can create something.
Hmm.
And in that way, doing a PhD is that freedom to use your imagination, your creativity to create something. And I think doing the PhD is a very interesting aspect of life because that's when you are doing what you are really excited about. You're doing your hobby with honest taxpayers' money. So
Uh-huh.
there are very few people who have that privilege
Uh-huh.
to do that. So I think people should think it that way, that you are really truly living the life of a human.
Mhm.
Um, you are imagining, you are creating stuff, and at the same time, you should be grateful to the honest taxpayers who are making it possible.
Yeah, that's a good way to go. Uh, okay, like regarding the mentors, like like there are lots of people who support your career, and many of the scientists need the support and mentorship or coaching. So, can you talk about your experience with the mentorship?
Yeah, I mean, so I was fortunate enough that I had good mentors, but at the same time, when you get a PhD, you get the PhD from the whole institute because in addition to your mentor, there are many professors, many scientists, and even your colleagues who offer you many learning tips.
mhm,
And the function of the right mentor is to facilitate that interaction beyond the
mhm,
lab,
mhm.
because inside the lab it's natural that you'll interact with people, but beyond the lab is what is the extra stuff that you get. So I was very fortunate enough that both my PhD mentor Steve K and postdoc mentor John Hoganes gave me that opportunity. They facilitated that
Mhm.
interaction with other people, other scientists and colleagues, and essentially that way of mentoring is a force multiplier. So I really like that way of mentoring.
Okay, that's good. Yep. And I know you are busy in your lab doing work, writing grants, and all those things. So, can you talk about your hobbies, like other interest other than research?
Well, the thing is, this is your hobby. I mean, this is truly. I mean,
Uh-huh.
there are very few people who truly love their work,
Hmm.
and so that's why I think I think of this as my hobby. And
Okay.
if you think of other people, when other people get to go to work, a lot of them they don't like their work, and that's why
Mhm.
they want to have something other than work where
Work.
they can enjoy their living.
Uh-huh.
But as I said, this is truly kind of my hobby, because as part of this, I get to travel, go to different meetings, conferences. That's a perk. And
Hmm.
um, so traveling becomes part of the hobby, you can say.
Okay. Okay. And you told me that like you have been doing a circadian rhythm from the start. So, how come you got interested in circadian rhythms initially to start with?
Well, the thing is, if you look at the biomedical research, most of the biomedical research is about what gene X does to gene Y, or how our body interacts with something else, a microbe or a pollutant, etc. So those interactions are very static. It doesn't have a timing component. But
Hmm.
you and I, and almost everybody who is listening to this, we all know that our body is not the same between middle of the day and middle of the night.
Hmm.
So understanding that biology of timing was a completely empty spot in biomedical research. While we clearly know that there is a huge impact of timing. For example, if it was middle of the night at 3 o'clock, I would have never woken up to have this conversation. But only because it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I agreed to talk to you. So similarly, if you think about it, almost every aspect of our behavior, physiology, metabolism have a timing component, and biomedical research had essentially ignored that for hundreds of years. So I thought that there is a big gap here,
Hmm.
and there's a big niche, and that excited me. And if you think of the timing, there is only one universal timing that permeates almost every species on this planet, and that's the 24 hours timing system or circadian rhythm.
Hmm.
So, in that way, you can learn the principle of circadian rhythm from one simple organism and can apply to another one. And that rarely happens. There are very few examples in biomedical research where you can take you can learn principles in neurospora or pond scum, cyanobacteria, or in plants and use them in humans. And in that way, this field is truly inclusive and also transformational in this sense that you can learn about the biology of timing from any organism and go across species.
And you have worked on circadian rhythm and longevity and all those things. So, you are. Can you please explain your talk, and you can go ahead and present your work?
Yeah, I mean, we can begin with that, but then if we think about longevity, longevity is a very interesting term. It's
Hmm.
sometimes we think longevity is just living a long life,
Hmm.
um, but I would rather live up to say 70 or 80-year old being completely active and fully functional than to live up to 150 years where half of my life is in the bed.
Yep.
So that's why what I'm really truly excited about is the healthy lifespan, or how
Hmm.
many years we can live being healthy.
Hmm.
So, in that context, maybe this is a good time to start the presentation. What
Yeah,
do you think?
sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so let's do the screen share. And okay. Yeah, so I would like to touch upon that longevity question, and with this provocative title, that can time restricted eating be a foundation for longevity? And to put it into context, if we think of the year 1900, if in that year a baby was born in this country, then she or he had a life expectancy of only 45 years.
Hmm.
And in 2018, if a baby is born, then it's likely that the person will live up to the age of 79 years.
Yeah.
And this addition of almost 39, 40 years happened very quickly because for almost 100,000 years of human history, humans lived somewhere between 25 to 45 years. But only in the span of 100 years, we almost doubled the lifespan. Then the question is why? How did that happen?
Hmm.
The reason why that happened was in 1900, the major cause of death was infection or infectious disease. And biomedical research figured out that most of these infectious diseases are caused by microbes, and that led to a cure by vaccination, antibiotics, and sanitation.
Hmm.
And in fact, right now, if we think of biomedical research or health sciences, you cannot think of living without sanitation, vaccination, or antibiotics.
Yeah.
In fact, almost every listener to this program can imagine they must have had at least one course of antibiotics, must have taken a vaccine, or at least must have washed their hand this morning.
Yeah.
And that's that profound. So now that we are living up to 79 years or 80 years in this country is very exciting, but at the same time, now the challenges are very different because we spend almost half of our life suffering from chronic diseases. And in fact, at the age of 65, when people in this country retire, nearly 85% of retirees have two or more chronic diseases for which they have to take a medication or they have to be under treatment um, for several years. And then what is the cause of the disease? Because as you can see, if we know the cause of the disease, then it's for example, if we know infection was the cause of the disease, then we went to microbes and then we figured out a solution. But here, the cause of the disease appears to be confusing. It may be the bad lifestyle choices that we make, and then the cure is rare. Um, because even now, if somebody gets diagnosed with diabetes, then the person has to be with medication for almost rest of the life. It's never cured.
Hmm.
So when it comes to lifestyle, and we know that bad lifestyle causes many of the disease, then the question is, what is lifestyle? And lifestyle has been very difficult to define because it's a very fuzzy thing. It goes from mindfulness, low inflammation diet, sleep, vitamins, etc. And how do we go through this and then come up with a better lifestyle? So the way we define lifestyle is what, when, and how much we eat, sleep, and move on a daily basis. So our daily habit actually is lifestyle. But most of us can relate to what and how much we eat, how it affects health. But then the concept of when we eat, or when we sleep, or when we exercise, how it affects health, that's a completely new concept. And that concept comes from the field of circadian rhythm. So now I want listeners or viewers to um, leave this presentation with at least 10 different takeaway messages. And then one of the messages is circadian rhythms are the ultimate science of vigor, vitality, and healthy aging. So the word circadian really comes from a Latin word which means nearly 24 hours rhythms. So that means Every physiology, metabolism, or any biological processes in our body that repeats itself in every 24 hours is a circadian rhythm. And just recently, I just published a book called Circadian Code. So viewers who want to learn more about the concept or its application, then this is a good source. So most of you know about one circadian rhythm, and that's going to sleep. For example, almost all of us who are lucky enough to go to bed around 10 o'clock at night, we get into our deep sleep around 2 o'clock, between 1 and 2 in the morning. And then, anticipating waking up, our body will actually warm up somewhere between 4 and 6. And if you habitually wake up around 6 o'clock, then right after 6 o'clock, between 6 and 8, your sleep hormone melatonin level will drop, stress hormone cortisol level will begin to rise. There is much better digestion in the first half of the day. Alertness is also pretty high. Our brain actually functions much better in the first half of the day. The athletic performance is much better in the early afternoon. And then in the evening, another rhythm, there's the melatonin hormone levels will begin to rise, our body will cool down, and we'll go back to sleep. So if you think about having a good, healthy day, then all of these processes must happen in our body. For example, we should have a good night of sleep, we should have better digestion, and our mind should feel pretty good and alert throughout the day. We should have a good bout of exercise, and when it comes to the evening time, bedtime, we should feel sleepy. And that's really is the sign of vitality and health. And how is this vitality maintained? So when we say circadian rhythms are controlled by circadian clocks, and these circadian clocks, the molecular clocks, are present almost in every organ. So, for example, almost all of us can imagine that there is a clock in our brain that tells us when we should sleep or how many hours we should sleep. So, irrespective of how tired you are, when we go to sleep, we typically wake up after 6, 7, 8, or maximum 10 or 12 hours. We don't continue to sleep. So, the function of the brain clock, as you can imagine, is to do that process. But surprisingly, in over last 20 years, the field of circadian rhythm has also discovered that almost every organ in our body has its own circadian clock. And then the function of the brain clock is to act as a master conductor and make sure that all these clocks are synchronized with each other so that the body can produce these daily rhythms in behavior, physiology, metabolism, etc. At the same time, all these internal clocks have to be tied to the outside world. So that's mostly through light perceived through the eye, and then that goes to the brain. And what is interesting is, um, although we see this general plan and it may not appear too impressive, recent research over the last 4 or 5 years from multiple labs are showing that almost every hormone, every brain chemical or neurotransmitter, enzyme, and digestive juice, and even every gene in our genome rises and falls at certain time of the day or night. That means our entire genome has a circadian rhythm. And this came very recently from a simple experiment done in our lab, and that came out last year in Science magazine. So what we are saying here is part of the brain called suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master circadian clock. There are only 20,000 neurons in our brain that act as master clock. And when you look at how many genes are circadian or they rise and fall at different time of the day. For example, if this is 6 a.m. in the morning, there are nearly 150 genes that rise and reach their peak level around 8 o'clock, and then they go down. And then at evening, there may be only 20 or 30 genes that reach their peak level. And although there are only 150 genes in the SCN that cycle, just few millimeters away in another brain center, there are also another cluster of genes that would cycle. And similarly, this is another part of lateral hypothalamus. This is white adipose tissue. This is one type of fat cell. This is another type of fat cells. This is pericardial fat, the fat cells around our heart. Um, this is fat in our belly, kidney cortex, kidney medulla. So almost every organ that we looked at had tens or sometimes very often hundreds of genes that cycle and they peak at different time of the day. In fact, if we continue, we sample nearly 64 different tissues or organs, and we find every organ has its own set of cycling genes. And if we combine all of these, then what we find is almost nearly every gene in human or primate genome may be circadian in at least one organ. So that's very profound because just like we have the genetic code that determines what proteins are coded in our genes, and epigenetic code that tells in which cell or in which organ that gene has to be turned on and off. Similarly, we can say that there is a circadian code to almost every gene. So that means every gene is programmed to turn on and off at a given time in a given tissue. And that adds another big layer of complexity to our biological system. So then the question is, how are all these clocks synchronized with the outside world? And almost 16, 17 years ago, we discovered that light is a very dominant factor that resets our clock. So when you are flipping the light switch in your bedroom, turning on light or turning off light, that is directly affecting this master circadian clock, excuse me, which acts as the conductor of all the rhythms. So flipping the light switch literally flips hormones and brain chemicals in our brain. So almost 16 years ago, we discovered that a protein called melanopsin, which is a blue light sensing protein, is present in only 5,000 squiggly neurons of our eyes. And these neurons are hardwired literally to the master clock in the brain. And what are the implications? We know that this melanopsin protein is less sensitive to orange light because it's a blue light sensor, or moonlight, which is very dim light. So as a result, our ancestors who did not have access to electrical lighting, when the evening came and they had only candlelight or moonlight, it was not activating melanopsin. So it allowed the sleep hormone melatonin to rise at night and people had better sleep. And during daytime, this melanopsin is highly activated by daylight because daylight is rich in blue light. And as a result, it synchronizes brain clocks, it raises alertness, and reduces depression. But in the modern days, as we spend most of our time indoor, then at night time, when we look at bright screens and bright light, that activates melanopsin, disturbs our circadian rhythms, reduces sleep hormone melatonin, and we have poor sleep. In the daytime, as we spend most of our time indoor in low light condition, then it misaligns circadian rhythm from day night cycle, reduces our alertness, we have foggy brain, and if it continues for several days, then we have sleepless night because we have too much light at night, and we have foggy brain because we didn't sleep enough and we don't have enough light indoor. And this, when this continues, then we can have seasonal affective disorders or depression and various other brain diseases. So that has led to the idea that we can change lighting and optimize lighting to promote health. And this is a completely new area of research and also commercial application that started with the discovery, simple discovery that there is a blue light sensor in our eye and that then trains our clock, which happened almost 16, 17 years ago in our lab. Then almost 6, 7 years ago, we made another discovery that can be summarized as timing makes healthy food junk. So, for example, when you think of a healthy food served on a clean plate, you always think of that healthy food. But if I serve healthy food on a dirty plate, then that becomes not so healthy. So similarly, what we find is if we are all programmed to eat, say during our regular wakeful hour during the daytime or a couple of hours into the night, But if food is presented at the wrong time in the middle of the night, then all the circadian clocks, they no longer listen to the brain clock or the light signal. They actually listen to food. So as a result, eating at the wrong time or eating at different time on different days can disrupt these rhythms and can disrupt all our rhythms in behavior, physiology, and metabolism. So um, how does it relate to our life? We know that people who do shift work, for example, pilots, doctors, shift workers, firefighters, astronauts, they go back and forth between staying awake during nighttime or staying awake during daytime, and that disrupts their circadian clock. And in fact, this is not restricted to only few people in the society. For example, our ancestors, they spent most of the night in dark and most of the daytime in bright light. They had good opportunity to sleep. There are a lot of physical activity during daytime, and their opportunity to eat was very limited. They ate 2 or 3 meals maximum during the daytime only. And our modern rhythms are very different. Almost all of us are now stuck in dimly lit room throughout day and night. We have very little sleep, we have very little physical activity, and we have a lot of opportunity to eat. And all of these actually disrupt our circadian clock. So you can immediately imagine somebody who lives this lifestyle, or maybe you yourself may be living this lifestyle where you don't have good sleep at night. You may be staying awake at least for 1 or 2 nights past midnight. That disrupts our circadian clock. And this is a very disruptive lifestyle. So, what happens when we live in such a lifestyle? So, living with broken circadian rhythms bring us very close to common chronic diseases. But at the same time, we should not think that common is normal. So, for example, nowadays a lot of people are obese, and we should not think that that's normal, because our rhythms have become so disrupted for all of us that sometimes we feel that that's the way life is. In fact, if we disrupt circadian rhythm, then we can also test what happens as a result. And all of us have experienced that just 1 or 2 nights of staying awake or eating at the wrong time in the middle of the night can cause these discomforts. These are not disease, but discomforts, for example, irritability, mood swing, compromised learning, for kids, fragmented sleep, and etc. But if it continues for weeks, months, or years, then what we are finding is almost 25 years of epidemiological research or controlled clinical lab studies or animal studies or genetic perturbation studies are finding that chronic circadian rhythm disruption can lead to almost 100 different chronic diseases, starting from childhood obesity, bipolar disorders, colitis, obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, and even various types of cancers and Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, many of the diseases that are shown in red here, they affect more than 10% of the adult population in the US. So that means there are at least 30 million people suffering from many of these chronic diseases. And if the science of circadian rhythm can improve their health by even 1% of the target population, then we are talking about millions of people improving their health. And if we think about longevity in this context, the reason why we are not living too long is the cause of death in modern societies have been many of these diseases. For example, cancer, heart disease, are among the top 5 causes of disease. Similarly, the other diseases that are here, they are among the top 10 causes of disease. So that means if we can reduce the disease burden, that opens the way for us to live longer. So now, how do we improve circadian rhythm? So we think of it as 3 different ways. One is training the circadian clock, picking up simple lifestyle habits that will actually improve our circadian rhythms. Second is clocking the drugs. Timing the drugs to the right time can improve their efficacy so we can be cured much faster. And then finally, drugging the clock. Maybe we can develop drugs against circadian clock components and those will cure disease. So, among these different aspects, we focus on what is called time restricted eating. And the concept is very simple. If you think of eating your breakfast in the morning, then as soon as we eat our breakfast, our body begins to absorb some carbohydrate from this food and it starts burning that carb as energy source. At the same time, it stores a little bit of fat. And as we continue our day with lunch and dinner, this process continues. Then after the last meal, slowly our body will run out of carbohydrate. And then during the eating period, we barely burn any fat. But after a few hours of fasting, we begin to burn a little bit of stored fat, and it continues. When the next day, when we eat our next meal, then this process again reverses. So we begin to burn some carb. So now imagine if we take these meals and spread it over longer time, then what happens is we don't have enough time to burn that um, fat because we are always we are always storing some fat, and then we always have some carbohydrate as glycogen. So, in a way, now you can think that by eating over a long period of time, we can reduce or dampen these daily rhythms in nutrient metabolism. At the same time, there are many processes that happen only during the fasting period. So, we also deprive our body for those processes. So, as a result, you can imagine that if somebody is eating within 10 hours every day, then there is always few hours of time at night when the person is burning fat. But if the person is eating the same number of calories over 15, 16, or maybe around the clock, then there may not be enough time to burn some fat. This is a very simple idea. So we wanted to test whether the idea is true. So almost now 7 years ago, we did a very simple experiment where we took two identical sets of mice which were born to the same parents in the same room with the same genes, with the same microbiome, and they ate the same diet. The only difference between these two groups was when they ate this food. So these mice got to eat the food whenever they wanted. So they ate half of the food during night time and half during daytime. And the second group of mice were fed the same number of calories as the first group, but they were trained to eat all these calories only during the night time because mice are nocturnal, they prefer to eat at night. And we continued the experiment for several weeks. Almost every week, we weighed the food to make sure that these two groups are eating the same number of calories. We also weighed the mice. At the end of 18 weeks, what we found is just eating randomly anytime made these mice very obese, whereas mice that ate the same number of calories within 8 to 12 hours, we call it time restricted eating, um, they were completely lean. And one very important point here is these two groups of mice ate the same number of calories. There's no change in calories, just the timing. And those obese mice were also showing signs of many chronic diseases that are among the top 10 causes of morbidity or death among Western countries. And what is more exciting is 2 years later, we took these mice, which are already sick, and then we ask them to eat all their food within 8 to 10 hours and we can reverse the disease. So that was also truly exciting because this time restricted eating not only prevent disease, it can also cure disease. Then we asked, when do people actually eat? So if you ask anyone, people will say that they eat maybe 3 square meals and within 10 to 12 hours between the first and last meal. But the problem is we often forget about the smaller meals that we randomly eat or maybe occasional eating that we do. So that's why we started a study. And in fact, this is still ongoing where anyone anywhere in the world can go to this website called mycircadianclock.org and can sign up for this app that we have developed in the lab. And the app, people take pictures of their food. In the first study, we asked them to take pictures of anything that they ate, even if it's a handful of nuts, little bit of um, yeah, small bite of some vegetables, everything that they ate, they took pictures. And then when these pictures came to our server, we lined them up along the timeline, and we asked people to record their food for almost 2 to 3 weeks so that we can also figure out how their eating habit changes between weekday, weekend, etc. And we called it feedogram. And we are looking at one typical person's very healthy person who is not a shift worker, seemingly healthy because we don't know whether they have any condition. And what we find is this person is randomly eating, and there is not much a sign of 3 meals a day. In fact, all the snacks are also listed here. And if we combine all this data, then we see that person has one type of eating habit during the weekday, that's the weekday, and then this is in the weekend. So as if the person actually goes to a different time zone because the person delayed breakfast, which also resets our or disturbs our circadian clock. And if we combine all this data and put it around a clock, then we feel like this is 3 weeks of data. This is 6 a.m., that's 6 p.m. You might think that this is an outlier, but in fact, almost 156 people who were in our study who were just regular worker who used to work for 9 to 5, they had this random eating habit. In fact, if we ask what time they ate, as expected, they would eat. Most of them ate something around noon. That's their lunch, and then most of them ate something around dinner time, around 7 o'clock. But then, if we ask how many calories were in the food, although in the midnight they are sparsely eating, those midnight calories, food were very rich in calories. And the bottom line was almost half of the people ate for 15 hours or longer. Then the question is, what is an ideal circadian day? How do we prevent disease? How do we improve health? So the way we look at an ideal circadian day is one should be in bed for 8 hours. We're not asking people to sleep for 8 hours, to be in bed for 8 hours. So that means out of those 8 hours, someone can sleep maybe somewhere between 6.5 to 7 hours, which is actually the healthiest amount of sleep for an adult. And then after waking up, maybe avoid food for at least 1 hour in the morning, because this is the hour when the sleep hormones are going down and then the stress hormones or the wake up hormones are coming up. And this is not a good time to eat because these hormones can interact with food in many different ways. And then after the first bite of food, one can continue eating or can have all the lunch and dinner within 8 hours interval, or 10, 11, or 12 hours. And we call it 8 hours of time restricted eating, 10, 11, or 12 hours of time restricted eating, but never beyond 12 hours. So between your first meal and last calories should be 12 hours. Of course, you are free to drink enough plenty of water during this fasting interval. We also, it's a good idea to avoid food and avoid bright light a couple of hours before bedtime, because that can interfere with our gut function, our stomach function, or the way our insulin is controlled, glucose regulation, etc. So no food for 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. At the same time, it's also very important to step outside to get some daylight. You don't have to look at the sun. Just being outside, even on a cloudy day, gives us enough light, plenty of light. In fact, just 30 minutes of some physical activity or 30 minutes of exposure to light is a great way to reduce depression. So just imagine, light is the best antidepressant we have. It's plenty and it's free. You just have to step outside for half an hour. Then the question is, some people ask me, what about coffee? Can we drink coffee? The reality is, if you stand in front of a coffee shop, you'll see that 90 plus percentage of people drink coffee with a lot of cream and sugar. So in fact, most of the coffee that we drink in this country, uh, a sweet concoction with a little bit of caffeine on top. So in that way, with coffee, we drink a lot of a typical coffee with cream and sugar has a lot of calories. So that's why we ask people not to drink coffee um, outside this eating window. And also, it's a good idea to avoid coffee at least 6 to 7 hours before your typical bedtime because many of us cannot break down coffee well, and having afternoon coffee can disturb your sleep. Then people ask, what about coffee in the morning? And this is where there are three exceptions. If your job is on the line, so for example, if you are working for a TV station where you have to go early in the morning and do the morning show, and it's impossible for you to stay awake or look less sleepy, so then it's okay to have some black coffee. And if it is a safety hazard, suppose say you're doing the night shift and you woke up here, sorry, you are going home here in the morning, or you woke up very early and you have to go to work, it's much better to be caffeinated and drive than to be sleepy and driving. And then finally, if you just can't live without it, and that's the last thing in your life that keeps you happy, then maybe you can have some black coffee between waking up and your fast calorie. So then the question is, if you do this time restricted eating, then what are the benefits? So this is a review that was published almost 3 years ago. So this is relatively old information, but this still holds good. So that time restricted eating can help, particularly 8 to 10 hours of time restricted eating can help to reduce obesity. So there is reduction in fat mass. But at the same time, if you combine it with healthy diet, then at least in mice we see they gain some lean mass or muscle mass. There is better glucose homeostasis. So in that way, people who have pre-diabetes, a very early stage of diabetes, maybe time restricted eating. When I say diabetes, it's type 2 diabetes, not type 1. Then they may improve their blood glucose and they may prevent or even reverse pre-diabetes. Then time restricted eating improves gut microbiome. So people who have some stomach upset and stomach issues, they may benefit from time restricted eating. In fact, we do see a lot of people who have acid reflux. They seem to benefit from that. So it's not that everybody will benefit, but it's a good thing to try. Then, and preclinical animal studies have shown that time restricted eating can reduce arrhythmia and improve cardiac function. In fact, it can reduce your aging of heart. So the heart functions much like a much younger heart. Then time restricting reduces chronic inflammation. So tissue inflammation goes down. People actually feel less pain in their joints and maybe they can go for a little bit more exercise. There is definitely reduced fibrosis and steatosis of fat deposit in liver. And nearly one third of adults in the US have fatty liver disease. So this is something that we're very excited if it is feasible for many of these people who have early stage of fatty liver disease, they can try time restricted eating and hopefully they will improve their condition or maintain it so that it doesn't get too bad. There are many studies coming out now that people who eat within a shorter interval, maybe 11 hours, if they're all food within 11 or less number of hours, then they have reduced risk for breast cancer. And also there are new studies showing prostate cancer risk also goes down by 20-25%. At least in animal studies, we do see cholesterol levels drop. This may take slightly longer for humans because of obvious differences between how animals and humans we metabolize cholesterol. We also find a lot of people who do time restricted eating, they report their sleep quality goes up. Some people find it very easy to fall asleep. Some people say their sleep, the number of hours they sleep also increases. And in terms of muscle, at least in animals and insects, what we find is mice that do time restricted eating, they have much better endurance. They can go on treadmill for a long time. And insects that do time restricted eating, they can fly even into their late old age. So in that way, what we find is time restricted eating can prevent or reverse or manage, better manage many of these chronic diseases that are in red here, or many of these diseases that have been the major cause of disability, morbidity, or death among modern population. So that's why we strongly believe that this can be one simple habit one can incorporate into their daily lifestyle, at least try to eat everything within 12 hours. And if you can make it better, then maybe 10 hours. And at least that will prevent some of these diseases so that we can add several years of healthy life to our life. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, let me stop sharing. I think you are muted. Let's see. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It is really, really interesting. So I hadn't seen that this part of the latter part of your work on time restricted. I had heard about it, but today it is kind of really interesting to look at the components. How do you manage your food habits and all those things and sleep habits? So I have one question.
Yeah.
Like people like it is possible to do that, but there are like as you know, the doctors, nurses, they have like 6 months or 4 months of night duty and all those things. So how do they manage that? Like I mean, like is there like for these genes and all those things, do they get adjusted with the time if you do some of the things in a certain way?
Yeah. I mean, if you're working the night shift and you are essentially, your body is thinking that it's in a different time zone.
Mhm.
So, people who work the night shift continuously and rest during the daytime, maybe they can eat all their food during nighttime because that becomes their
Right, right.
biological day.
Okay.
And the challenge is in the weekend when they try to come back and socialize, then that becomes a bigger challenge. So that's why it has been a little bit difficult for shift workers. Another thing is shift work is not just one type of work or one
Excuse me.
schedule of work. So, for example, some shift workers may be working 24-hour shift, some do 12-hour shift, some do 8-hour shift. And even those who are doing 8 to 10 hours of shift or 12 hours of shift, their shift may rotate in
Okay.
every week, in every month, or in few months.
Yeah.
So there is so much heterogeneity in shift work that it's really hard. And the way I look at it is we created shift work without knowing the relevance of circadian rhythm or how bad it is for our health. And now that we are learning about how bad is shift work, maybe slowly the public and also the policymakers will think more clearly about it and come up with certain regulations. For example, maybe the shift, if you're on night shift, then you should be on night shift for a couple of months at least so that your body adjusts to that before you come back to another shift. And similarly, one should not be changed from day to night shift within the same week. So these are some of the policies that we feel that should come to force. This is just imagine several decades ago when we did not know what is the bad effect of asbestos and lead. We
Yeah.
had built many buildings with asbestos and lead. And once we knew the bad effect, then it took almost few decades to change that. So similarly, now that we know what is the bad effect of circadian disruption among shift workers, hopefully that will slowly trigger the public, the shift workers themselves, to begin demanding better shift, better management, etc.
Okay. That's a good one. I have another question regarding like you had mentioned like you can modulate with the drugs and all those things, right? So is there any effort going on, like anything has been done in terms of treating this with the drugs to change your the gene expression at certain time and all those things? I think it is a little more complicated, but is there any work is being done on that?
So there are two aspects. One is timing the drugs. So the drugs that are already in market, not for circadian clocks, but for say your blood pressure
Yeah.
or for glucose regulation, etc.
Mhm.
Um, there are some studies showing that certain blood pressure medications, if they're taken in the evening, they work much better in reducing blood pressure than the same medication taken in the morning. So similarly, there are medications to reduce joint pain, arthritis pain. Although the pain is more severe in the morning, if the drug is taken at the night, then it has much better effect on reducing pain in the morning. So there's several examples now, and similarly, actually this field, which is now called chronomedicine or timing of medicine, it started almost 3 4 decades ago when people figured out that some of the cancer drugs to treat breast cancer work much better in the morning or evening. So it depends on the drug and depends on the target of the drug. So this is a completely new area of medicine. But just imagine that among the top 10 best selling drugs in the US, for every person these drugs benefit, there are 3 to 20 people for whom the drug actually doesn't work. So if we can improve efficacy of these drugs even by 10 to 15% by timing them properly, then we are talking about millions of people who will benefit enormously from these drugs and they can cure their disease. So that's the impact of the future impact of chronomedicine. And finally, when it comes to circadian clock and drugs, this is an emerging field. This is a very new area. And just recently, just last year, we published a paper that showed that many types of cancers do not have a circadian clock, they have a dysfunctional clock. So then the question is, if you reactivate the clock, what happens? So we reactivated, kind of, you can think of reactivating a clock with an agonist for one of the clock component. And that actually made the cancer cells susceptible to death. So the cancer cells die with this drug, clock drug, but not the normal cells, because the normal cells are so used to circadian rhythm that they're fine. But then the cancer cells who have lost track of timing, they don't have the timing discipline, you bring back the clock, then they die. So I think that's a very exciting area that some of the clock drugs might be very effective in treating inflammation, cancer, etc.
And going back to the your previous answer on like you can give the drug at different times depending on like whether it's cancer or so is there any work done on, for example, in the body insulin release happens more during this time so that you can, or like major kind of metabolic aspects like secretion of hormones and or absorption, like for example kidney, like you have more like absorption of minerals during certain period of time. Is there any work done on to, because that is one of the I think key component of the whole area if you want to monitor or do the drug at certain point for different things. Is there any much work done on that?
Yeah, almost. That's why I say almost every hormone in our body has a circadian rhythm. They rise and fall at certain time. And in fact, insulin release is much better in the first half of the day, but is not so well in the evening or late night.
Okay.
So in that way, um, just timing your carbohydrate-rich food to the first half of the day is a good thing to do. But when it comes to insulin releasing drugs, for example, incretins or GLP-1 drugs, there is not much work done on what time this should be administered. But with this circadian rhythm gaining more and more recognition, I'm sure there are some clinical trial going on right now somewhere in the world to test that. So similarly for kidney function, for gut function, almost in every area now there are works going on.
Okay. Okay, I think we are almost there time. So
Yeah,
thank you very much, Dr. Panda. It's been really nice knowing you, knowing your work. I really appreciate you coming and spending your time on a Science Hangout. And thank you so much. If you have anything, something new coming up, you can just shoot me an email. We can have another hangout on some new work anytime.
yeah, yeah.
So I'm really flexible. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadashiv. I'm happy to be here and I'm looking forward to more and more shows from your side.
Sure. Thank you so much.